Well, I was born in Glemsford. I'm a true Egyptian. I was born in number 7 Wimble Row. My mother was a Hildegard, who'd lived in Glemsford all her life, and my old chap, he was a Cambridge boy, one of 15. They lived in Granby Cottage. There were 13 boys and 2 girls. I had a wonderful childhood. Down the woods, in old harvest fields, we used to hear the old-fashioned tag would come. We'd nip down the wood and cut a great old stick with a noble on end, and when they old stacks got down to about 3 foot off the ground and the rats used to come out, we used to have a wonderful time. Summer holidays were spent down the fields making bows and arrows and different things like that. My mother and father were right religious. And how I got into organ playing, I suppose, because my father used to play the organ at Cambridge Chapel. And when he took the job as verger at Glemsford Church, he packed up organ playing, and nobody in Glemsford knew he could play an organ. And he used to say to me sometimes when I was a little boy, go and have a look out the door, see if there's anybody about. And I used to go and have a look out and round, I'd say, ain't nobody about. And he'd open the organ up and play it just as though he'd never been away from it. And nobody knew, because he always used to say a verger what can play the organ is too handy. So he packed it up. Nobody knew in Glemsford. My mother used to sing in the choir, so I was brought up going to church every Sunday and singing in the choir. So the next thing was piano lessons. And I used to hate piano lessons, so I packed that up. And then one day the old organist at Glemsford used to come from Belsham, and he used to stay there because they used to have a 9 o'clock service and 11, so he didn't drive back. He'd say, "Me, you used to play the piano, didn't you?" I'd say, "Yeah." He'd say, "You packed it up." I'd say, "You hate it." He'd say, "Have you tried playing one of these?" I'd say, "Oh, I never played one of them." And because he didn't know my old chap could play, so he said to me, "Well, if you want to have a go on it, you can." And I started playing the organ at Cambridge, at Glemsford Church in the mornings, just for a half hour between the 2 services. And that's how I got into starting to play the organ. And apart from that, there was a lot of boys. We used to play football on the green. I loved football. And Church Gate in Glemsford was just like a village on its own. There was a pub up there, there was a shop. We went to Glemsford School. There was no cars then. Used to have to walk. And my old mate used to bike from Boxton on a three-wheeler bike. And I used to wait for her. He'd top of Barrels Lane. And when he got there, I used to stand on the back of the bike with my hands on his shoulders. And we used to go down to Glemsford School on the back of a three-wheeler bike. And yeah, I had a wonderful childhood. When we left there, we went to Clare, but I lost my mother when I was 12. And things sort of start to take off then. I was like a free cannon. I started to do my own thing, and my old chap never used to come back from work till 6 o'clock at night, so I was at home. And I got a job on the co-op bikes. There used to be a co-op down Glemsford with a big basket on the front. I used to do one half a village, and my old mate used to do the other half. And we used to have some wonderful times on this old thing. My old mate one day, in the snow and the race, he come out the house on his bike and went right across the road, and he went right in the door of Ridge Underwood's meat shop and knocked all the sausages off the buddy lines, the meat off the counter. There was hell to play. And we used to do things like that. When we went to Clare School, when we was 11, that's when things start to take off of us old Glemsford boys. They couldn't sort of do much to us, and the tales I can tell about Clare School are wonderful. There used to be an old boy lived down the road in Glemsford. We had a music lesson one afternoon. We sing these old songs like the Trout and all the old folk songs. And he was a jarring one morning, and the old music teacher say, "What number are we starting on?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "No, you've been talking, ain't you? Instead of getting the number right." He said, "Come here." And he used to have a stick, what he used to wave time with on the piano, and he's having to hold his hand out, and he whipped the stick right across his fingers. All of a sudden, the old boy took his jacket off. He said, come on. He said, "I'm going to hit you in the guts." And The bloke got up off a piano stool. No, he said, there's no need to get violent. And he took him in the next room and gave him a peppermint. And I had another old mate, because in the beginning and the end of when the 60s started, we all grew long hair. And we was in school one morning, and my old mate from Glemsford next to me, he said, stand up, headmaster. He stood up, he said, have you still got a barbers in Glemsford? He said, yes. He said, come up here. And he took him up on the stage and he gave him 5 bob. He said, when you get home tonight off a bus, he said, you go in the barbers and get a haircut. So anyway, next morning we was waiting for the bus, and the old boy come with his OXO tin full of sandwiches under his arm, stood there. I say, you ain't had a bloody haircut. He say, you'll forget about that. Anyway, we was in school assembly, had the hymns, then the prayers, and then the notices. He say, he forgot about me. All of a sudden, old forest headmaster said, stand up. He stood up, he said, you haven't had a haircut. He said, come up here. And he took him up on the stage. He said, why ain't you had a haircut? He said, I couldn't be bothered. He said, well, what'd you do with the 5 bob I gave you? He said, I bought a pack of fags. And he picked them up and put them on the table and gave him a terrible thrashing with a stick. But these things used to go on like out of a night down the silk factory at Glemsford. The windows used to be open because of heat in the dye works. And in the dark, you can see people in, but when they're looking out of a lighted room, they can't see you outside. And we had a whole load of bangers one day, and we hauled these in through the window down the silk mill, and they were banging, going ahead. All of a sudden, we went to go up the street, and the bloke come out the back. He say, if you want your bikes, you got to come in the dye works and get them. Well, you damn go home without your bike. Mine was blooming near new, and so was my old mate, so we were dragged in the dye works, and they got the dye, and they put it all over our faces, so we looked like bloody clowns. And there's a brook in Glemsford, down Checky Lane, but run there. We went down the brook, and we couldn't wash it off. And then went to school for 3 days, because we looked like bloody clowns. So we didn't go and hold the fireworks in there no bloody more. But how I got into poaching, there's an old boy from Stansted called Arch Theobald. Worked on the land all his life. And I went down the farm one morning. I was only about 14, because you go down there with Seabrook and people like that, and there weren't nobody about, just Arch and old Johnny Big, the farmer. So Arch say to me, hey, got a fag, Bullock? I say, oh, I ain't got the fags. I say, you got the fags? He say, no. He say, don't get me pension till Thursday. He say, I ain't got the money. He say, do you know, he say, if I had some snares, he say, I could make some money, but I ain't got any. So I say, how much are snares then, Arch? He say, about 4.5, 4 halfpenny. I was in old money. He say, you can get them from Sudbury. So I went home. I got a £1 or 2 in the thimmy while working on the co-op bike. Went to Sudbury, bought some snares. That tea time, I watched old Arch, because they were all shiny. He put rubbed them in dut and everything to take a shine off so they wouldn't notice. And he went and cut some pegs. Went with them, cut some pegs, and then the little thing would hold the snare up is called a pricker. Little thin bit of hazel. Anyway, there's a meter. And we went and put these snares down. The next morning, we'd got about 10 rabbits. And we made, I think he got £0.50 each for them at the time. So he was all right. He got some fags. I had a fag and all. I shouldn't have done, but I started me smoking. And that's how I started poaching. Then after that, he used to go down the lane near the farm just as it got dark. He used to wait and hear the old pheasants go up, and he'd go down and shoot them. I'd go down with him. And that's how I give. But when Arch got old and he couldn't go no more, I still used to take him a brace of pheasants every week, and I used to knock a door. I used to say to him, I told the Arch on it, the bloody apprentice got to bring you pheasants you can't get out now. But that's how I started into poaching. And poaching and organ playing never really went together. So I reckon I could have been the first one what started that. But that's how I got started the poaching. When I left school, my first job was a few months, was down the Glemsford silk mills, and I started work down there in the dye works. down the bottom, and the dye works was right down the end of the silk mill, surrounded by fields, and because you couldn't hear the noise in the dye works because there were all the silk machines going all over the factory. And the old boy I worked with down there, he had a 12 bore in the cupboard, and every winter, well that winter, they used to step out 40 yards from the window and put a peg on the bank in the field, and there used to be pheasants about there. And then all of a sudden you'd be working away there, and an old pheasant would come creeping up the field or out the bank. Well, that used to stop the dye works, and we had a big steamer there with a pipe on the end, and we used to turn that on and steam the windows so the pheasant couldn't see in. And we used to open the little window. I used to be the dog, and he used to stand there, get his 12 bore ready, and I could hear him saying, "Get ready, get ready, get ready." And just as I got near the peg, he'd blow this old pheasant down, and I used to run out the door, down the field, pick it up and bring it back. And this went on for a few months, but I got the sack down there and then. He reckoned I couldn't do nothing with me, so he got rid on me. So that was my career in the Glamsford Dye Works, finished. But, oh yeah, and then I got a job up, a part-time job up a cemetery, cutting the grass at Glamsford. I had a snare line going up there. I used to catch having all the rabbits round there. And I remember one old boy, he say, "You'd ever bring me the bloody rabbits?" I say, "Well, do you want a rabbit?" I say, "Never rabbit." He say, "Yeah, court, I'd love a rabbit. This old boy come from London." Anyway, on the Friday, I took my rabbit. "Court," he said. I say, "It's a beauty, look." I say, "Here you are, here it is," and give it to him. I see him on the Monday. I say, "Did you get on to that rabbit?" "Oh," he said, "I threw it in the dustbin." I said, "Threw it in the dustbin?" I said, "What you ever on about?" I said, "It was a bloody lovely rabbit." He said, "Do you know?" He said, "I stood in the shade Saturday morning for 2 hours and I couldn't pluck it." And that's what they're like today. Some of these, if it weren't for Tesco, they'd starve. But he tried to pluck a rabbit. I've never heard nothing like that before in my life. And then that weren't long after that, I got a job with a building firm in Stansted. And we were doing a job at Couple. And my old mate, who I was working with him, an old boy called Ivan Slater in Glamsford, and he come poaching along with me for years, me and old Slater. We were building the flint walls down there, and there's a big spinney at the bottom, and the old pheasant. So when it got winter time and you could hear it was getting dark, you could hear the old buds cocking up, going up the rust in the trees. We used to nip down there and shoot a couple on the way out and things like that. And I used to get my old car and go round and shoot one of a dinner time. All at dinner time we used to have a rifle. Used to put a couple of bob, everybody in the hat, and I used to draw the name out, and whoever got it had got the pheasant. And there used to be an old boy called Arthur worked there, and he used to say to me, "Cool, I'd love a pheasant." I used to say, "Well, come along with me, Arthur." Just after that it got dark, we used to walk down the track in the spinney and look up in the trees and say, "Now, which one would you like, Arthur? The one on the left or the one on the right?" "Cool, I'll have the one on the right." And I used to drop back down, and they used to do that for dinner. But one of the best things whatever happened down here one day, that was tea break. And my old mate from Boxted was ploughing a field at the side of the spinney on a crawler. And I said to my mate Ivan, "I'm just going to have a word with my old mate on the crawler." So I go up the field a couple of times and eat me sandwiches on the crawler. Anyway, I got on the crawler. He said to me, "Are you going to the wedding next Thursday?" I say, "Wedding? What wedding?" He said, "Well, there's a wedding in London." He said, "The boy Pooley's getting married." I said, "I ain't had an invite," because we used to knock about with the Pooleys down the hall. I say, "You going?" He say, "Yeah, I'm going." He say, "The whole estate are going." I say, "What, the keeper and all?" He say, "Yeah, the keeper and that. Everybody's all going up in a big bus. They put a bus on." He say, "There'll be nobody about." So anyway, I never thought no more. When I went down to White Hart and come back to the tea hut dinner time in the White Hart that night, we arranged to shoot for this Thursday. And there was about a dozen on us. There was people with bloody slug guns, I got an old 410, there was another one with a 20 bore, and we shot the whole estate. Bloody old dogs. Some of them run off and never come back no more. When they got home, they went to the garden. Anyway, we had a bloody good shot. We went down to White Hart that night and split everything up what we'd got. Anyway, this was a Thursday. On the Saturday morning, I was sitting at home. There was a knock on the door. I went to the door. Who should be standing there was young boy Pooley, Toby. So he said, what the hell have you been up to? He said, we've been discussing you at breakfast. He said, you had a bloody shoot on the estate while my brother was getting married in London. He said, I tell you what, he said, Bullock, he said, when I get married, he said, I'm going to get you to play the bloody organ so I know where you're sitting. Me and my old mate, I had an old mini pickup, and we went poaching, and you should never take a car. I was always told by Arch Theobald, where I started with, never take a car, never take a bicycle, never come out of a wood by a gate. Always come out at the thickest part what you can come out, because if anybody's waiting for you, 9 out of 10 times they'll be standing near a gateway, coming out, drive out of a wood, a gateway, or anything. Anyway, this particular day, this week, there'd been a shoot at Boxton. An old gamekeeper was leaning over the gate near Boxton Church talking to the squire about the shooting the day before when a gun went off. And they thought, well, who the hell is shooting about here at this time of the day? And they walked up the road, and when they got to the driveway near the wood, there was a Mini Cooper stood there with black windows top of the range. And they'd left the keys in, and that were Branson. And because they used to knock about with us down Boxing Hall, Branson and them. Anyway, this here particular night, we was out and all. And Branson, they waited, took the keys back. When he come back to the car, he was nabbed. Anyway, that weren't about an hour later, there was a great old cock pheasant sitting in the gamekeeper's garden in top of an apple tree. And my mate had a couple of shots at it, and he missed it. I say, come out the way, let that bugger. And I put a shell in my 410 and blew it out the top of the apple tree. Didn't know the gamekeeper was in the bloody shed. He come running out, I'll have that. So we shouted to him, you'll have to move a bit bloody quicker than what you usually do. And we were gone. I got picked up in Glemsford. And the old carper say to me, you'll have to eat sausages for the rest of the week, for a few weeks now, Bullock. And when he lifted the seat up of my mini pickup, up was full of pheasants. And the gun, he took a gun, and they couldn't understand why the thing had been took off at the, what do you call it, the ejector. But it didn't matter. So anyway, I didn't finish here. I went to Sudbury Court with my mate, and Branson went to Berry Court, because his father used to live in Thetford, and his father was a lawyer. And when Branson went to Berry Court, his father spoke up for him and said, my boy will either finish up in Norwich jail or he's going to be a millionaire. Well, we all know what happened to Branson, where he is now. Anyway, I went to Sudbury, me and my old mate on my bikes. Went into court, and they didn't know what to do with us. So anyway, they sent us down to see the probation officer. And he was a black man. And there was all these old boys waiting to go into court or just coming out, and they were all hanging on the bloody beam outside like monkeys and flying about. Anyway, me and my old mate went in front of the probation officer, and he made us stand there for about 7, 8, 10 minutes, never seen nothing, with his foil. And all of a sudden he looked over his glasses. Ah, he said, Mr. Bullock, pheasant. I say, yes, I was hungry. And this bloke say to me, this black man, he said, fiddlesticks. So I said to him, I said, fiddlesticks be fucked. I say, ain't you ever been hungry when you was in the jungle? And he went berserk. And he wouldn't have nothing to do with us. So they took us back down the cells again. and we had to go back up into court. Anyway, the old judge, he fined us £26, which was a lot of money then, and he confiscated my gun. And he said to us, he said, have you anything to say before you leave the court? I said, well, you know, you made us tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth on the Bible. He said, yes. He said, what's that got to do with it? I said, that also says in the Bible, brothers, we should bear one another's burdens. So if I bring my hat round, I shall expect everybody in this courtroom to put £1 in. He said, if you don't leave this court immediately, he said, I shall double the fine. And we left the court, that was a Tuesday, and we went out Friday night and shot the fine. Anyway, the tale didn't finish here. About 15 years later, when Branson started the big Virgin Airlines up into America, the whole middle of the Barry Free Press was full of it. And the picture of the old keeper, who was a Basil Mitchell, he was still alive, but he'd retired and was living at Great Barton. He was about 92. Anyway, when Branson took them Virgin Airlines into America, they refused him a drinks licence because he got a criminal conviction for poaching. He got it overturned because you knew he would anyway. But the old keeper, he's in there, he said, I don't hold nothing against these boys, he say. If I see them in a pub, he say, they owe me a couple of pints. And the tale didn't finish there, because when they relettered and done Boxed at Church Roof, about 20 years later, the old squire at Boxted sent a letter to Branson saying as he'd been caught on the estate for poaching and had been on the estate, would he like to make a contribution to the Boxted Church Roof Fund, but he didn't get a letter back. There's an old boy living in Glamsford called Roy Port. He's been a bit of a lad in his time. He's had a few pheasants in his time and like a pint of beer. And we were in the Prince of Wales at Glamsford one night and Roy was in there. And who should come in was, well, a Pooley. So anyway, they had a few drinks and Port was a-talking to Pooley. He said, how did you come to get this estate, Pooley? Oh, he said, that was left to me by my father. He said, how did he get it? He said, well, grandfather. He's saying, how did he get it? He said, well, that went right back through history from one relative to the next to the next. He said, and actually, we got it in the first place because my relation way back in history fought for the country in the Crusades, and they were given the land and the manor. All of a sudden, Porter took his jacket off. He said to Pooley, he said, come on, outside on the bloody tarmac, I'll fight you for the bugger. But he wouldn't come out. I remember one day, been out poaching down Cavendish Way in the woods down there, and we got some pheasants, and the cops were on a tail. And there used to be an old boy in Cavendish used to sing in the choir, old Don Angel. And we didn't know what to do with these pheasants. And we thought, I don't know what we're going to do with all these. We can't take them home because the cops will come home. So I went round Don's in Cavendish. I say, don't do me a favour, will you, Don? He say, what's that? I say, don't keep these pheasants for me. I say, till tomorrow I'll come pick them up about tea time. He say, well, yes, boy. I say, we got the cops on a tail. He say, ain't no problem. He put all the pheasants in the washing machine and put a sheet in the washing machine to say at the finish so the coppers couldn't see what was in the washing machine. They went round the house, but they couldn't find anything, so we got off of that one. And then another day, we'd been poaching, and we'd been in the big woods at Stansted. Anyway, when we finished, we thought we'd have a few beers. And we went in the White Hart, and instead of a few got a lot, and we all got drunk. When we come out, the car wouldn't start, so my old mate buggered off up a road. He saw him off home. I come up the street. When I got the phone box, I fell over, and I couldn't get up. I was so drunk. Anyway, I thought that was a nice night. I thought, oh, I'd lay here, and I laid against the phone box. and fell asleep. Anyway, that weren't about a little while later. I opened my eyes, there was a blue light flashing. When I looked, there was a sergeant stood there and a young carper. And I heard the sergeant say to the young carper, "Go on, ask him what he's doing lying here." So he said to me, "What you doing lying here this time in the morning?" I said, "Well, I just had a brainstorm." So the young carper said, "Brainstorm? What are you on about?" I said, "Well, you know the world go round." He said, "Yeah." I said, "If I lay here long enough, my house will come by on it." "Go on, book 'em," the sergeant say. "Book 'em." He say, "What for?" He say, "Poaching, drunkenness, any bloody thing, book 'em." And they put me in the car, took me to Sudbury police station, and they had to carry me in. When I got the desk, a sergeant stood there with a charge book on the desk, and I'd got hair then down to me waist, and I'd got an old trilby on with a face and feather, and the sergeant say to me, "Name?" I say, "Geronimo," and he put it down. And I had the whole night and the day in the cells. The house was searched while I was in there, but they didn't find nothing, because I never used to keep me pheasants at home or anything like that. But it weren't long after that I teamed up with an old Norfolk boy, still live in Glamsford. We still go out and get a dinner now and again, my old mate. And I remember one night along here, we went to this wood about 2 miles away, and it had been a snowing, heavy snow. Anyway, we got in the wood, and that was a snow, and once you get in the wood, that's lovely. They reckon a wood is the only place you can work in 52 weeks of the year, where the weather, and once we got in the wood, the snowflakes were just trickling down, and we walked round and got these pheasants, and that was a rough old night. The wind was a-blowing, and that was a-blowing the snow up and everything, and inside this wood, that was beautiful. You could have slept underneath an old tree. When we come out the wood and the wind hit us, cool, that was rough, and I was walking along. I'd got a 410 in my belt. He'd got a slug gun, because what we used to do was he'd shoot the ones sitting in the open, and I'd get the ones what sit in the thick. And we had an old dog. That was a crossbred Alsatian, and he was a bugger. If there was a pheasant in a thick tree or a bush, and we went by and didn't see it, he'd sit down. And we used to come back and say, "What the hell is wrong with you, you silly old bugger?" And look in the thick, and if you looked at it properly, then you could see this silhouette of this old cock pheasant in there, and then blow it out the tree. Wonderful old dog. But anyway, we were walking out, and you couldn't see in front of your snout because of this snow. That was blinding. He got the slug gun, I'd got the 410, and what we used to do is, because if you get about, I've heard these old boys say, "Cool, went out last night and got 40 pheasants, that's a load of crap." You get 20 in a sack and bring them 2 miles, you know you'll got them. And we used to take it in turns to swap the sack over, because they used to get heavy at 100 yards. Anyway, we was a-walking, all of a sudden my old mate say to me, look up, where you going?" And I went straight down this deep ditch in 4 foot of water, and the barrel of my gun struck me in the guts, and I can see the old dog sitting there now, as much as I say, "What are you doing, you silly old devil, lying about me in all that water?" Well, anyway, I got out, and that was so bloody cold. After I'd been walking a little way, I started to heat up, and I got tired, didn't want to walk. My old mate say, "You can't stop, you've got to keep going." And I was never so glad to see the bloody lights of Glamsford that night. And I come in, I was soaking wet, and I ran the hot bath, got in the bath, had a couple of glasses of whiskey, and never even got a bloody cold. But my old mate now, he do a lot of the shooting now, because with these top of the range slug guns, once they're on the telly wires in them woods, that's good night nurse once you're up against the skyline. And he get the bloodlust, and sometimes you'll go round where there's a pen, and I've had to say to he once in the big wooded station, I say, "Well, I had to stop." I said, "I can't carry the bloody sack." And one night, we'd got so many in the sack, I say, we're never going to get these back to bloody Glemsford. We can't carry him right up them fields and through the churchyard, because there's a place in Stansted where you can ford the river. And that ain't deep. You can get through it with your Wellingtons from one side of the river to the other, and then walk up and through the churchyard at Glemsford and back home. So we sat in the wood just near the edge, near the road, thinking what we're going to do. I say, I'll tell you what we'll do. I say, you know that house there, that old woman living in that house, I know she. I say, I'll go knock the door. Anyway, I went and knocked the door because the light was still on. She come, who is it? I say, it's Rodney. Oh, she's saying, she opened the door. I say, you wouldn't do me a favour, would you? She say, what's that? I say, if I give you a couple of pheasants, I say, can't leave a sack there till later on tonight. Well, yes, boy, she say, put them in the shed. It's the key. Take the key on you, she say, because I'm going to bed soon. When you come back down the road, she say, unlock the shed, put the pheasants in your car, she say, and the key in the letterbox, and we'll all be happy. She say, I got a dinner and you got your pheasants home. And that's one night where we got out on it like that. But one night coming out now, Lumpet and Courtwood at Glemsford, what we used to do was, when we come up the footpath, there's a big old oak tree just before you get the road, and I used to lean on this oak tree, put the guns down we used to and the bag of pheasants, and I used to stand leaned against this oak tree having a fag, because you could see right over Stansted and Malford watching the world go by, and my old mate would walk home, which used to take him about 15-20 minutes, pick the car up and come down the road and then pull into the side where the footpath is, and I used to put the guns and the pheasants in the boot and off we used to go home. Well, one particular night we come up here, got the sack and the guns. He said, I'll nip and get the car. They're about 15-20 minutes. I said, righto. And there's a little bit of a pull in there where a car can pull in. Anyway, I stood having a fag. About 15-20 minutes later, there's a car pulled up. I thought, hello, my old mate is here. So I picked the sack of pheasants up, 2 guns armed to the teeth, run round the back of the car like I used to, went to lift the boot, and that was locked. So I run to the window of the driver's side. I said to him, I say, come on, open the bloody boot, I can't get the pheasants in there. And that was a complete stranger. And he seen me stand there, and I'd got 2 guns under my arms, and his eyes come out like bloody organ stops. And I never seen a bloke look so bloody frightened in his life. And then I was like, oh, fuck off. And he pissed off, and my old mate arrived about 5 minutes later. I must tell you this tale before I talk about other things. There used to be an old boy kept a pub in Glemsford called the Cock. He was a Scotchman called Jimmy Ross, and he was an alcoholic. He used to drink 2 bottles of Queen Anne whisky a day. Well, people like me used to get in there and ride porter. And what porter used to do was, he'd got an electric clock in this pub. Instead of having it behind the bar, he had it down the other end. And what porter used to do, when it got to 10 o'clock, they'd turn the electric clock back 3 hours, so they'd only show about 7. Of course, they used to get on the piss in there, didn't they? And then the old boy used to shout, it must be time, it must be time. And I used to, don't talk so daft, Jim. I say, it's only 10 o'clock. And that was really about 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning. Anyway, this old boy, he and many a time I've seen port with him, I had to carry him up to bed. And he used to say, don't take my trousers off, as I was carrying him up the stairs. But one particular night I went in there, I hadn't got a lot of money. I bought a pint of better. I said to Jimmy Ross, I say, wouldn't like cockle for dinner? Would you, Jim? Cool. He said, I've got some people coming Sunday. He said, I'd love a cockle. I say, what? He say, what up, why? I say, I reckon that why about £9, could be 10, something like that. He said, I'll have it. He said, how much do you want for it? I say, £1 10 shillings. That was old money then. He said, I'll have it. Anyway, I said, I'll go and get it. I walked out the back door of the Cock, down the yard, opened his hand cup, pulled his cockerel off a perch, wrung its neck, waited till it stopped fluttering, and took it in, and all these old boys sitting in there was watching this going on, and I give him this cockerel. I say, Jim, Cord, he said, that's a bloody beauty. He give me £1 10 and he give me another pint of beer. This was the Friday. Went in the Sunday. I say, how'd you get on, Jim Cord? He said, that cockerel was bloody beautiful. He said, we had that for dinner. He said, I've got enough left over for tomorrow. He said, you ain't got no more, have you? I said, no, not at the moment. I said, that was the only one the bloke got. Anyway, that was the finish of conversation on a Sunday night. He bought me another pint of bitter. I went in the following Friday. He went berserk. He said, I'm never going to live this down in Glemsford. I said, why? What do you mean never going to live it? He said, I've had my own fucking cockerel. He said, I've been having the piss taken out of me, all the customers. He said, I've gone and had my own fucking cockerel. And he bought me another pint for me bloody cheek. That was Jimmy Ross. Yeah, and but I was in there one night. We was all on the booze in there. That was Easter Sunday. Porter and all them were in there. And Jimmy was well on the way because he was on about half a bottle of his second bottle of Queen Anne whiskey. And Porter turned the clock back about 3 hours. Jimmy Ross was behind the bar and a Scotch woman was in there because he was Scotch, and they'd got this jukebox on the wall and she kept putting this record on that was called The Lights of Old Aberdeen, and she kept saying, come on Jim, have a dance. In the end, he couldn't stand it no more. He lifted the flap. He looked at me, he say, get behind the bar, Bullock. He say, you're the only one in here I can trust. And I looked round and I thought to myself, there must be some bloody rogues in here tonight then. Anyway, I got behind the bar. I hadn't been in there behind the bar about 5-10 minutes. I was always known as the best barman in Glemsford out of this. Who should come in with 3 blokes, a Scotchman and 2 others, well-known drinkers. So the first one say to me, you behind the bar then, Bullock? I say, yeah, Jimmy's on the way, look, he's dancing. Cool, he said, I'll have a treble whiskey. So I give him a treble whiskey and he give me 2pence. Anyway, I put the 2pence in the till. He said, excuse me, barman. He said, my change. So I opened the till and give him a penny back. Other one stood there. He said, Cord, I'll have a treble brandy. He had treble brandy. The other old boy was on rum. He had some rum. And this went on for about an hour. All of a sudden, somebody come in for ounce of old Holborn. And that was about 7 and 6pence then in old money. All of a sudden, I give him old Holborn. 2 people left because they said we was robbing them. Give him the old Holborn, he give me a £1, I give him a right change. Jimmy barged me out the way. Get out the way, he said, you're robbing the bloke. And he give the bloke another £1 note. And the bloke was just about to say something. I said, oh, just forget it, go. Anyway, we were in there till about 3 in the morning, and the clock still only shew 1 o'clock, because Porter had turned it back, and the Scotchman who was on the whiskey never got out of bed for 4 days. And I never see the Gorner Porter. I don't want to happen him, but I don't think he was seen for a couple of days, and he was used to a pint. But that was a bloody good night, that was. But out of that, I got a job with Cuttons, driving a lorry. And many a time I've been to Newmarket on a Friday and hid the 410 up under the seat in the lorry, and on the way back used to slow down when I got the other side of Stansfield coming home, and I used to slow down and watch the old hedges, and I used to get out the bloody lorry and shut them on the way home. I used to take orders. People used to ask me for bloody orders. Can you bring me a pheasant and things like this? I remember the manager in the Spa supermarket in Meldenhall, he said, if you can't bring me no more bloody pheasants than this, I was going to change my dealer. He said, God, this went on for years, getting these pheasants out the hedges on the way back from Newmarket and things like that. But I used to like old Cutton's job. I used to go round Norfolk and meet all the old boys round there. And but all good things come to an end because Cutton's finished, and I finished up grave digging for 20 years all round the villages. I used to go as far as Stoysted near Braintree, Hawksley near Colchester, But I used to do all the villages, Headinghams, Cavendish, Glemsford, me and the old dog. That was a nice job, that was, grave digging. I used to like it. A lot of people wouldn't have liked that, but I used to like it. So I had me freedom. We used to get up in the mornings and you could dig them and you would finish sometimes for dinner. Apart from places like Balford, Lavenham, Ashen. Ashen, I've seen grown men cry in Ashen, digging graves. Because when you finish one in Ashen or Long Malford, you felt like lying in the bloody thing yourself. Because they was a hard. But you just take the good with the bad and the hard with the soft and they equal themselves out after a while. I remember one night or one morning I had a knock on the door. When I went to the door, there was two blokes stood there, showed me this card with the Sun newspaper. And they said, we've heard over the grapevine that you're a poacher. I said, yes, what's that got to do with you? He said, well, we just got a parson in Norfolk in the paper. I said, I read that. They said, we just got the bloody organist now. He said, do you mind if we have a word with you? And my mother-in-law was stood there. She said, cool. She said, I thought you was going to get me on page 3. She say, no, that's he we want. He ain't got the tits for page 3, but he got the balls to be on page 5. So anyway, they come and sat down, and he say to me, have you got a pheasant? And I told him, I say, no, I ain't got a pheasant. No, he say, we could do with a pheasant. He say, to make it thinny, I say, I'll go and get you one. I didn't tell him I had got one. I said, I'll go and get you. Good. He said, can you get one, mate? I said, yes. So I got my 410 out from back behind the couch, went off up a lane and had a fag and come back and got the pheasant what were hanging up in the shed, and I brought it in the kitchen as though that was still, got me hand going like that because these old boys of London didn't know what was going on. So that was still a shaking and going, cool, get the camera, George, get the camera. Anyway, they took these photos of me for the Sun and read it down, and the headlines on the page in the Sun was "Slay it again, organist rides a poacher," and I never got no bloody money for it. And I went in a car one day, went up to Boothby Street in London. They were in Boothby Street then, I think they moved now to some newspaper. I went in there to see about some money, and there was a black bloke stood at the counter. He said, you are the money and all, boy? I said, yeah. I said, what you are? He said, yeah, ain't me, he's saying, for Suffolk. He said, but I ain't got the money. Anyway, I had a go at him about it. I didn't get the money, but they sent me some lovely photographs, which I show some to you and that. And apparently I was in the Weekend magazine, Titbits, because I said in the Sun, poachers should never be taken to court for poaching. That's a drug. They should be sent to a rehabilitation centre and weaned off it, like they do drug users, and things like that. And anyway, that weren't long after that, there's an old boy live in London. He was born in Wimble Row, where I was born in 7. He was born in 14, but he's a lot older than me. He's now in his 80s. And he used to come down to Glemsford when his mother and father was still alive, and he used to come down and see one or two people he went to Glemsford school with. But he can't get down here now because he can't drive, so... but he phoned me up every Thursday and asked me how things are going on in Glemsford. And he used to own a big restaurant in the city. And he used to phone up every Monday and order 25, 30 pheasants. And he used to come down every Friday. He had a big Trans Am. And he used to meet us in the back car park of the Cock at Glemsford, because that was the only one where you was hid up from the road. Nobody could see you. And he used to pay us then. He used to buy 2 dozen Newcastle Browns left behind the bar, and he used to give us £1, 10 shillings for every pheasant. And this went on for years, 4 or 5 years. We used to get this letter about once a fortnight, 130 pheasants, and we used to go out and shoot them. The only time we couldn't shoot them was because I don't know whether you read an old poaching book, but I'd all start with a load of crap. It was a bright moonlight night. That's a load of shit. And that's a bright moonlight night. You either want to be in bed or in the pub. The rougher the night, the darker the better. Don't go out on a moonlight night. They can see you before you see them, and things like that. But anyway, one particular day, this old boy, he sent us a letter. He wanted 30 pheasants desperate for the restaurant. And this was the Monday we got the letter. And the moon was coming up this here particular week, coming up towards full. So my old mate say, what we're going to do, we're going to have to get them some from somewhere. I said, all right. Anyway, we went out and we'd got about, I don't know what it was, 21 buds for he. And he say, shall we make it up to 25? I say, yeah, but you can't go out tonight now, that moon is right full. He said, well, let's go out in the morning and take a chance with the car, just out that bright light, to see if we can get another half dozen. And there's a big shooting range at that time of day down Stansted, and we went down there, because that summer I was working stacking bales in the hot summer of '76, all round the fields. And I used to dump some sometimes on the side of the ditches, just one or two, because an old pheasant, in the morning when it's cold, he liked to get on top of an old straw bale. I don't know why, because it must be the heat rising out of it. And we went down there this particular morning. Anyway, we shot 4 or 5 pheasants down there, and on the way out on the track, heard this engine. So my mate say, there's a bloody boat coming up here somewhere. I say, ain't a bloody car. I say, that sound like a Land Rover. Anyway, when we see it coming on this track, that was the gamekeeper. And he was coming like a wind down this track. Anyway, I'd got an old Mars Minor. That's all I'd got. And we went straight by him. And when he turned round and he got by the track the other way, and as we come out in the road, he hit the side of my Mars Minor in near the wheel, and we'd got guns and pheasants in there, and in his hurry to get out the Range Rover, he opened the door. He couldn't get out the driver's side, get out the passenger side, and he found a 15-foot ditch. And the last we see on him in the hurry of getting out the bloody Rover was a pair of hands going down the side of the ditch shouting, "Oh!" So anyway, I backed off, and he hadn't damaged my Minor, or I didn't get out to look. And all of a sudden I said, hold on, Ivan, I say, we're going to have a good ride home. And we come into Stansted, up near the church, and they were all waiting to go to Bushbow Gallons for the bus to come. We went roaring out the junction, they was all looking and shouting, "Oh!" And we went down the hill, and as we got to the bottom of the hill in Stansted Street where the junction was, I said, hold on, Ivan, I say, we're going to take a chance here that there ain't nothing coming. And we pulled right out into the street. Lucky enough, the Tony Allen bus was about 100 yards further up the road. And we went right out in the street, out to the bridges at Scotchy Bridge where the road split for Boxton, Glemsford. And I say, we ain't going to Glemsford. He say, where are we going in? I say, well, along here towards Couple, I say, there's a huge big stack of bales where I stacked them. I say, there must be 500 or 600 bales on this stack. I say, let's hope we can get to the end of the wood for the turning, so when he get to the bridges, he'll be in, think we've gone back to Glemsford. Anyway, I was watching my mirror, and we got round the corner of the wood towards Boxton, before we see any car hit the bridges at Stansted. And we pulled up behind the stack, hid the guns inside the bales and the pheasants, and went home round the Boxton church, dropped Ivan off. When I got home, my missus say, cool, she say, I'm glad you're back. This was about 10 to 9 then. She said, I've got to take the kids down to school, but I want to go down to shop. So anyway, she went. I got undressed, sat in the kitchen, just with a pair of pants on, reading the paper, looking out the window. All of a sudden, I see a squad car go by, about 5 miles an hour round Schoolfield. I thought, I don't know. I come round a second time, All of a sudden, my missus come roaring in the back garden, in the Mars Miner, come running in the house. She said, "What you been up to?" I said, "Why?" She said, "I've just been arrested for bloody poaching outside the post office." I said, "You have?" Next minute, the cop car come, and they come in the house, and they said, I said, "What you lot want this morning?" He say, "Well, we got reason to believe you've been poaching at Long Melford on the Campbell Hall estate." I said, "Long Melford?" I said, "I ain't been to bloody Melford this morning." I said, "Look, I only just got to bed and ate me breakfast." I said, "I ain't got dressed yet." And they went and looked at my Mars Miner, and there weren't a bloody dent in it. Anyway, I was took to jail. I was put in the cells, took me belt and me shoelaces, so you shouldn't hang your bloody self. And he give me a cup of tea, and everybody know what police cell tea is like. You can see the bottom of the bloody cup. But anyway, I was in there all day and half the night, and I had to go in front of this carper and another one. They put the thingy on, was asking me questions, and they couldn't understand my Suffolk accent. This carper, they come from London, and they kept stopping the machine because they couldn't understand what I was saying, because I was talking like my mother never used to say, "Don't you understand?" So I used to say, "Well, don't you understumble?" And they couldn't understand what understumble and things like, or coulda heck, or things like that, and they used to have to keep stopping the tape machine because they couldn't understand what I was saying. But lucky for them, there was an old boy in the station, come from Sudbury, a policeman. He used to play football for Sudbury Wanderers. So he knew my accent, so he had to bring he in, throw one out, bring he in, and then start the recording again. But I got away with that and all, and they couldn't pin nothing on me, because I'd left the pheasants and the guns on this stack. He'd all hid up under this stack. But that was a few months later, Easter time. I was walking down the stairs at White Hart, and I got to the bridges at Scotchy Wood. I stood there having a fag, and the old gamekeeper come through Stansted, and when he got by the bridges, he seen me standing there, and he pulled up, and he backed up. He say, "What are you watching them go up tonight?" I say, "Oh, I retired now, ain't I? Retired," he say. "You buggers never retire." He say, "Anyway," he say, "have a fag." And we stood there having a fag. He say, "I don't hold the grudges," he say. "But if I catch you again," he say, "I shall take you to bloody court and get you nailed." And that was a bloody good tale, that was. It weren't long after that we had a job. We was doing a big old barn, building at the Parsky's farm in Hartest. And in front of the barn was this huge pond, and that was full of ducks. And there must have been 50 or 60 on there. Anyway, we had an old slug gun at that time with a silencer on the end. And because it don't make so much row anyway, there was a big knot hole in the side of the barn. It must have been about 3 inches across. And dinner time, when old Parsky'd gone in for dinner, we used to cop one of these here ducks off the thimmy, or sometimes we'd get a bit of corn out of his old bin and just put a trail up, and when we was in the doorway of the barn, they'd come walking by and we'd knock one down. Anyway, I'd got so bad that old Parsky still got the farm at heart, still tell you if you asked him. He used to come out, we'd watch him through the knot hole counting the ducks. And then about 3 or 4 days later, he'd come out again counting the ducks. Anyway, I'd finished up after we was there about 3 or 4 weeks. There was only about half a dozen ducks left. And I remember Parsky come round the barn. We say, "We're finished today." I say, "I think you'll give us a bloody duck for dinner, aren't you?" "Duck for dinner?" he say, "Bullock, you've still got the bloody fat round your chops from the last 20. But anyway, if you asked old Parsky, he'll tell you the tale about that. There was another old woman, posh old gal up at Walgrove Farm at Lawsville. She was on about this duck. "I've got a lovely fat duck on my pond," she said. "That's beautiful." She said, "I don't know where it come from." She said, "It's wonderful colour." Anyway, within a half hour of she saying that, was underneath my seat of my car, ready to come home for dinner on Sunday. And another good old place used to be where Denston Village Hall is, all the way from Denston Village Hall to a pub what used to be called the Plumber's Arms. There's a deep ditch, and that ran the road all the way to the Plumber's Arms. And what happened was we used to get a driver, and they used to drop me and my mate off at the Village Hall Bridge here at Denston. He used to carry on and go to the pub and have a couple of free beers because there weren't a drink driving so much in as what is now. And my old mate with the Wellingtons and that, we used to walk the ditch all the way from Denston Village Hall to the Plumber's Arms, which was about a mile, just under a mile. And of course pheasants love to sit over water. We always reckon that's because perhaps they feel safe by sitting over water. And of course when you're walking a deep ditch, you can see all of them sitting above from the skyline. Wonderful. We used to knock these old pheasants down along this water course, and then we used to go put them in the boot of the car and the guns, and we used to go in Denston Plumber, change the shoes out the boot and go in the Plumber's Arms and have a couple of free beers. But I remember going along there one night with my old mate, and we were shooting these pheasants along in this water course. All of a sudden there was a hell of a commotion, and over the top of the bank come this great old gander, and that was just getting near Christmas, and my old mate shot he and all. He come down the bloody bank. We had to pack up that night and walk the rest, get out on the road in the field the other side because we couldn't carry the bugger. And if anybody had seen us with this great old gander's beak and head over his shoulders, bloody pure white, walking back to Denston Plumber's Arms, and old boy in the car in the pub say, "You ain't been long tonight." Say, "No, we got the bloody Christmas dinner." But all these water courses and woods, I remember shooting a pheasant in Courtwood once with my old mate. Well, I shot more than one, but I got stuck up in the old crotch of a tree. It must have been about 30 foot up, lay there. So I give my old mate the gun. I say, "Hold up." And I climbed right up the top of this tree to get this pheasant out the top of this crutch. He say, "What the hell are you going to do if you up there and the bloody gamekeeper come?" I say, "You tell him we work for bloody BT. I'm just checking the lions." But we used to get some hung up in the bloody trees and had to get up and get down and get at them like that. That was all part of the game. But they were lovely times, they were. Yeah, years ago in the 60s and that, we used to be friendly of the boy poolies, and we used to go down there on the booze and things like that, or he'd come and pick me and my mate Chris up at the White Hart at Stansted, and they used to put a bottle of whiskey in the back of the Land Rover, and there used to be a couple of free on us, and one would sit on the front with a 12 bore, and he used to ride round the fields, and we used to shoot rabbits in the dark and things like that, and then we'd take somebody else would get in the back and have a glass out the whiskey bottle, somebody else. That was every man for himself holding on to these bloody Land Rovers, going round with a purdy. That was a purdy, weren't any old gun. Anyway, they used to have these big parties down there, and we used to get invited down there for a drink or two, and went down there one day. They had a big barbecue and party on down there, and the top guest was a girl called the Lady Jane Wellesley. She used to go out with Prince Charles at one time. Anyway, they'd got all the lights on and the barbecue and the music on, and we three old boys sitting on a church pew what had been put on the grass, and we was having a few beers. We'd had more than a few. We were sort of pissed all on us. And anyway, they got to where we was, and he come along with the Lady Jane Wellesley, and he said to old Bob sitting beside of me, he said, "Bob, I'd like to introduce you to the Lady Jane Wellesley." And Bob got off a seat with his pint mug in his hand and sort of half bowed, "Good evening." And he said to me, "Rodney, I'd like you to meet the Lady Jane Wellesley." And I sort of got up with my pint mug, "Good evening." And my old mate Chambo sitting there was out his head, sitting on the bench. And he said, "I'd like to introduce you, Chris, to the Lady Jane Wellesley." He say, "Who the fuck is the Lady Jane Wellesley?" He said, "Good God, Chris," he said, "you know who the Lady Jane Wellesley is, the Duke of Wellington's daughter." "What?" he said, "I wouldn't mind fucking an old boot." And she went berserk, and she pushed Chambo, and he flopped back on the church pew, and the whole pew went backwards, and we'd all got a pint mug in our hands, and as we went backwards, that all went over us, and we lay there on the grass, covered in brown and bitter, and as she went off, she said, "Fuck you and all," and she pissed off. We never saw her no more, and that was her. But going back to poaching, before I come back to Boxing Hall, I got a couple of tales I'll tell you here. We'd been in the London Angling pits at Glamsford, shooting pheasants. And what happens is you can walk a long way to get in the pits. So what we done was we sent a letter to the London Angling Association saying as we were keen naturalists and photographers and our main interest was ducks, we'd wonder if we could have a key to go into London pits to study the wildlife. Well, blow me, about 10 days later come this envelope with a key to get in the gate with a letter saying, "You're welcome to go in and hope you have a lovely time studying the nature." Well, of course, that was all right up our street, wasn't it? We could just go down the road and open the bloody the lock and get in there and walk round. Anyway, one particular night in there, we was walking around shooting these old pheasants what were rusting about there. And when we come back round the circle of the pits to the front where the road is a place there they call osier bed. That used to be grown for the baskets, for the willer and things like that. Anyway, we was just coming through this osier bed bit back to the gate when a mini van pulled up. You could tell that was a mini with the sound on it and the lights. And at the end of the osier bed was a big fence. So anyway, the door shut and the van come along the front of the osier bed and parked outside the gates where we were hidden through this spinney. All of a sudden you could see this figure climbing up through the fence at the end, making a hell of a row, getting over this wire fence. And me and my mates, we were all in the middle there, and I said to him, I said, "I'll bet you a pound or a penny he come waltzing right towards us where we're standing." So my mate say, "Well, if he do," he say, "I'll whop a torch on." Anyway, he'd got all that spinney to walk through, and he come right to where we was, creeping down so he couldn't see us, and he was just going to take 2 steps, and he stood on us, and my mate whipped a torch on right in his face. And that was another poacher, old boy Sibbins, what come from Lavenham, and he was frightening the life out on him. And we had to roll him a fag. He was a bag of nerves, stood there, didn't know what to do. So, "What the hell are you doing in here?" He said, "Well, I thought he'd get a pheasant." He said, "Well, what about that van?" He says, "My mate," he says, "he's waiting to pick me up when I get to the gates. I'm going to climb over the gates and he's going to take me home." Anyway, we say, "We'll have a laugh along here." So I got one arm, my mate got the other one, and his old mate was got his back to the gate having a fag. And we walked up to the gate and said, "Do you know this man?" And the old boy turned round, he said, "Oh, never seen him before in my life." He thought we was the bloody river bailiffs. And we had a bloody laugh about that, but the tale didn't finish here. We went to Barry one day and walked in this restaurant that was full of people, and all of a sudden I heard this shout from the back end say, "There ain't no bloody pheasants in here, Bullock." And that was the old boy what we'd picked up in that spinney, old Dollar Sibbins. And and another tale about poaching is I got put out of work one September. I went to the job centre at Sudbury, and I knew the old boy who was the manager. He was the son of old Harry Lee, used to keep a garage in Glamsford. So we went walking in there and I met him. He was stood there. He said, "What you doing in there, Rodney?" I said, "I got put out of work." "Cool," he said, "I'll soon find you a job." I said, "I don't want a job." He said, "What do you mean you don't want a job?" I said, "I don't want a job really." I said, "I want to go poaching for the next 3 months." I said, "And sort of acting stupid and making a bob or 2 on the side." So he said, "Come in here." And they used to have these little kiosks where you went in with a seat where they interview you. Anyway, he got a cup of coffee, give me a fag. He said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." He said, "I won't give you a job or send you a card to go for a job till the end of February, as long as you bring me a brace of pheasants every week." I said, "You're on." So every week I used to walk through the Ballroom Gate precinct in Sudbury with a sack with 2 pheasants in, and I used to he used to call me in the kiosk. We used to have a cup of coffee and a fag, and I used to give him the 2 pheasants, and he never sent me for a job at all until the following March. And this went on the whole winter. And there was another old boy who had a garage in Clare, and I used to take his pheasants, and he used to fill my mini pickup up a petrol, and I had a wonderful time that winter.